So unfortunately, I had not noticed, but for the past 4 or 5 episodes here, I had my microphone setting set to my default to the laptop, which is absolute garbage. But I have figured it out now, and it seems like the waveform is a bit better going through my external microphone, and hopefully it will sound better. So we are going to continue here with Common Sense by Thomas Paine. We have finished the main body of his work, and now we are moving into the appendix. So he begins. Since the publication of the first edition of this pamphlet, or rather, on the same day on which it came out, the King's speech made its appearance in this city. Had the city of prophecy directed the birth of this production, it could not have brought it forth at a more seasonable juncture, or at a more necessary time. The bloody-mindedness of the one shows the necessity of pursuing the doctrine of the other. Men read by way of revenge, and the speech, instead of terrifying, prepared a way for the manly principles of independence. So, here we have something pretty straightforward. There is a speech given by the king. Unfortunately, he doesn't give us quotations from it, but there is a speech given by the king in which, instead of having the effect of terrifying or intimidating the colonists of America, they had the opposite effect. They prepared a way for the manly principles of independence. So, he brings in, again, a religious conception. He says, had the spirit of prophecy directed the birth of this production. The spirit of prophecy. So anytime, I think anyone mentions anything, a spirit of anything, close attention needs to be paid. Because the recognition of spirit, regardless of if one is a Christian or an atheist, is nearly one and the same, in my opinion. Had the spirit of prophecy, the spirit of prediction, of predicting future events based on current circumstance. Had that spirit directed the birth of that speech, it could not have brought it forth at a more seasonable juncture or a more necessary time. In other words, like we've been talking about prior to this in Samuel Adams' American Independence, this is a particular era of time in which the portal is opened. Pandora's box, if you will, is opened. Perhaps that's not the best analogy. It's more like a window, a brief period of viewing in which we can recognize different spirits. We can recognize the divine intervention. We can recognize the spirit of liberty. And through this speech and into its antagonism, we find, and in the particular circumstances, we find this spirit of liberty, the principles flowing from it. So he continues, and he says, ceremony, and even silence, from whatever motives they may arise, have a hurtful tendency when they give the least degree of countenance to base and wicked performances. So ceremony, a gathering together, a celebration of some event, the elevation of some, perhaps maybe not, well, certainly it is an elevation. It is the coming together, and in this unification of different people towards a common purpose, we have the elevation, the sort of emergent component, perhaps. And he says, even silence, even the lack of speech, wherever they may come from, they can have a hurtful tendency when they give any degree of support to the lower and to the wicked performances. So I want to reflect on this just a little bit, specifically in terms of ceremony. So again, if we return to the idea that ceremony is this uniting event, and if we are to suppose that this event, this celebratory event, is to give any degree of support to something that is low, or to the wicked performance, in this case the speech of the king, then what you're uniting under is a base, not necessarily desire, but something that is not going to bring forth the optimal unity. What you're uniting under will, in fact, in the future, as it plays out, erode. It'll have negative consequences to the whole, because what it is unifying under is weak. It has a weak capacity to stabilize that ceremonial body, let's say. Wherefore, if this maxim be admitted, it naturally follows that the king's speech, as being a piece of finished villainy, deserved and still deserves general execration by both the Congress and by the people. So, condemnation, essentially. Yet, as the domestic tranquility of a nation depends greatly on the chastity of what may properly be called national manners, it is often better to pass some things over in silent disdain than to make use of such new methods of dislike as might introduce the least innovation on that guardian of our peace and safety. So this is another interesting sentence. He says, yet, as the domestic tranquility, this local peace, this sort of stability, this undisturbed way of a nation depends greatly on the chastity, this abstinence. Certainly it often refers to abstinence of sexual intercourse before marriage, but a chastity, a refraining of intercourse between what? Depends greatly on the chastity of what may properly be called national manners. So what might this mean? So either it means that the national manners themselves need to be restrained, or it means that the national manners, sort of like an individual has the capacity to do, the national manners must be chaste. So the manners themselves must be inherently abstain from doing certain things. So those are two interpretations. I'm not quite sure which yet is the most accurate, but it is often better to pass some things over in silent disdain than to make use of such new methods of dislike as might to introduce the least innovation on that guardian of our peace and safety. So he says, sometimes you have to just stay quiet. Let things pass over in silent disdain than to make use of new methods of dislike that might introduce the least innovation on that guardian of our peace and safety. In other words, the guardian of our peace and safety, and innovation to that, something that improves it, makes it more efficient, makes it better, is what we desire. And it is possible that if we don't adhere to these national manners, perhaps, then it is possible that we run the risk of introducing a new method of dislike that can damage our guardian, the guardian of our peace and safety. And perhaps it is chiefly owing to this prudent delicacy that the king's speech has not before better than a willful, audacious libel against the truth, the common good, and the existence of mankind. So again, and perhaps it is chiefly owing to this prudent delicacy that the king's speech has not before now suffered a public execution. The speech, if it may be called one, is nothing better than a willful, audacious libel against the truth, the common good, and the existence of mankind, and is a formal, pompous method of offering up human sacrifices to the pride of tyrants. So another particularly interesting statement there. And so he says, the speech, if it can be called one, is nothing better than a willful, audacious libel against the truth, the common good, and the existence of mankind. He says the very existence of mankind. Those are lofty charges. And is a formal and pompous method of offering up human sacrifices to the pride of tyrants. And of course, at this time, America is engaged in conflict with England. And so it is not a far stretch to say that this pompous method within the king's speech, this attempt to terrify, is in reality a method of offering up human sacrifices to his own pride, because the very institution of the monarchy is something that is not ordained by God. It is nothing that is found in nature. And so he continues. But this general massacre of mankind is one of the privileges and the certain consequences of kings. For as nature knows them not, they know not her. And although they are beings of our own creating, they know us not, and are become the gods of their creators. So, essentially I just mentioned it there, that the institution of the kingship is not known in nature. The kings don't know nature. Nature does not know the king. And so how can you have let's say a divine, maybe we can't say divine, because the kingship is inherently a secular authority, but it is an elevated institution. They do have the capacity for emanation, or top-down edicts. And these top-down edicts, of course, are not just purely material. They are immaterial. They can influence what we conceive of as good. They can influence what we conceive of as love. They can influence the way we see our reality. They can distort our relationship between ourselves and the divine. And so they have this they are in disharmony with nature, for they don't know it, and nature doesn't know it. And they are the very creation of mankind, and yet they don't even recognize itself. It's as though, which is prevalent in our society, a mind is separated from its body, and there's no shortage of these people. You can find them everywhere you go. The terribly obese, the people that seem to, certainly not without reason, but seem to ignore the cries of the body they ignore their physical reality, and they feel themselves elevated above it. And of course this is a fallacy, because it eventually will lead to their death. But an interesting observation nonetheless. The speech has one good quality, which is that it is not calculated to deceive. Neither can we, if we would, be deceived by it. Brutality, the tyranny appear on the face of it. It leaves us at no loss, and every line convinces, even in the moment of reading, that he who hunts the woods for prey, the naked and untutored Indian, is less savage than the King of Britain. So, a quite extensive dig there at the King of England. But in some sense, this is good. The speech of the king is completely explicit. There is no attempt here for blinding the eyes of those who attempt, who hear the speech, or who read the speech. It is tyranny in its face. And of course, these sorts of things, evil shows its face when it feels comfortable to do so. Otherwise, it relegates itself to temptation and the more cloaked types of deception. But in this pathological institution, this developed cancer that is the monarchy of England, it has gained such a degree of confidence that it can express itself at face value. And this an interesting analogy here. It leaves us at no loss, and every line convinces, even in the moment of reading, that he who hunts woods for prey, the naked and untutored Indian, is less savage than the King of Britain. In other words, it seems as though there is a cultural understanding here that I'm trying to push myself as a modern man to understand, that many at that time would go out into the woods and hunt for their prey and encounter perhaps these untutored Indians. And so they have an implicit understanding of what these Indians were like. Certainly, even given our, cultural wokeness, I think it is reasonable to understand that an untutored Indian is a bit of a savage state. Now, savagery, unfortunately, cannot be eroded from the human condition. It is our culture that preserves the light of the mind, and the untutored savagery can find us at any age and at any time, and perhaps even at any stage of life. So the untutored Indian is less savage than the King of Britain. It's interesting again. He continues, Sir John Dalrymple, the putative father of a whining Jesuitical piece, fallaciously called The Address of People of England to the Inhabitants of America, has perhaps, from a vain supposition that the people here were to be frightened at the pomp and description of a king, given, though very unwisely on his part, the real character of this present one. Quote, But, says the writer, if you are inclined to pay compliments to an administration which we do not complain of, meaning the Marquis of Rockingham's at the repeal of the Stamp Act, it is very unfair in you to withhold them from that prince, by whose not alone they were permitted to do anything. So, interesting here in this appendix, Mr. Paine is not shying away from any sort of criticism. This is a quite harsh criticism to open this paragraph with, saying this putative father of a whining Jesuitical piece, fallaciously called the Address of the People of England to the Inhabitants of America. So, what I gather here what he is saying is that from the vain supposition that the people here were frightened at the pomp and description of a king, which of course is not the case. We have spent the past 2 paragraphs discussing the opposite effect that the King's Speech has had. But he says, if you are inclined to pay compliments to an administration, which we do not complain of, it is very unfair in you to withhold them from that prince, by whose not alone they were permitted to do anything. So, how dare they bite the hand that feeds them? If it were not for us, if it was not for this administration, this government, they would not be, the key word here, they would not be permitted to do anything. Obviously, he says here, in this sentence, it is very unfair in you to withhold them from that prince, by whose not alone they were permitted to do anything. Again, the key word is permitted. And what follows from this key word of permission, of permitted, who has the authority to give this permission? And of course, as we have learned throughout this book, it is obviously not a man-made institution. This sort of permission comes from God and God alone. It comes from the divine. It comes from the thing that is. Now, I'm perfectly aware that we can design institutions that are committed towards the truth. We can build universities. We can build churches. All of these institutions are designed to bring us up towards the truth. However, even though these institutions are designed for that purpose, they do not have the permission to direct us in the way that is implied here. Again, it is very unfair in you to withhold from them from that prince, by whose not alone they were permitted to do anything. It is not the priest, it is not the pastor, it is not the professor that governs, in a certain sense, governs their action. Now, of course, there are limits to this, and it's a difficult thing to describe because very quickly my mind moves to the family and the authority of the parents. And in our society, we recognize that government has no business in the institution of marriage. Well, I shouldn't say in the institution of marriage. Obviously, they're involved there. But in the family, they have no right. In my opinion, I should say, they have no right to be involved in the institution of marriage. Even in, I would argue, the complex dynamic that is the family, it is the responsibility of the parents to discover the divine principle and give it to their children. Now, it's not perfect, and judgment here may seem harsh, but they do have the permission to direct their children in which ways that government should never be allowed to do again. But even so, even though they have this permission under secular law, it doesn't mean that they are not without constraints. Certainly, parents, even under secular law, there are things that they can't do. They can't sexually abuse their children. They cannot physically harm their children. They cannot neglect them. And exactly where this line is to be drawn I'm not entirely sure. And why we have drawn the line where we have drawn it seems to me a bit arbitrary. Certainly I don't advocate for sexual abuse or of physical violence against children, but this is rather a reflection on the nature of the relationship between the state and one of the most fundamental institutions of man, which is the family and marriage. And if I'm going to get back to the point here, the point is that there are inherent limits not only to individual action, which we have discussed, and that involves the very structure of the self, of the cognitive being that is the human being of man, but also of a parent's relationship and interaction with his children. And there is a fine separation between the church, or rather, the state and that institution. And I say the church because the church is the institution that is designed to bring light to the mind, that gives us the ability to see the divine more clearly. And if we are able to do that, then we can better understand how to raise our children and our family, and how to interact with one another so that we can produce a stable society, so that we can maintain a unity, so that we can prosper, so that we can bring God's word down to us and spread his kingdom across the land. And so it is from this reflection by Mr. Paine here on the English official, or whoever he is, the putative father of a waning Jesuitical peace, an Englishman, no doubt. It's this reflection that is, of course, at the level of the relationship of government and man, but as one quickly realizes, this is something that transcends all of this. This is a perennial pattern of human existence. It applies as much to the family as it does between man and government, or in this specific case, between man or subject and noble authority. So he continues, "This is Toryism with a witness. Here is idolatry, even without a mask. And he who can calmly hear and digest such doctrine has forfeited his claim to rationality. Is an apostate from an order of manhood, and ought to be considered as one, who has not only given up proper dignity of man, but sunk himself beneath the rank of animals, and contemptibly crawls through the world like a worm." Okay, so a round of applause for Mr. Paine here on continuing his harsh criticisms. So I did a little digging here on Toryism. They were their roots, I should say, are of a particular brand of English conservatism. And their motto is something to the effect of God, King, and Country. And you can see how this might be opposed to the liberal order, the liberation of man from that type of institution. So when he says this is Toryism with a witness, he's saying essentially that this particular brand of conservatism that is trying to conserve the very institution that oppresses us, I am here to witness it. Here is idolatry, even without a mask. So, again, a reflection to the Old Testament. There is no shortage of the Israelites falling into a state of tyranny and unfortunate despotism, if that's not too harsh, under many different kings, in which they would erect temples and worship false gods, and then they'd have them torn down again, and they'd eventually they go back to doing it again, in this never-ending cycle of lunacy, and they can never just get it quite right. They can never just listen to the prophets and take in the word of God. And so he says, here is idolatry even without a mask. And he who can calmly hear and digest such doctrine has forfeited his claim to rationality. So you can see the degree of separation here. And although I personally may have a particular bend towards liberalism, I tend to lean on the conservative end of that. And that is to say that I perfectly agree with what the American revolutionaries were trying to do, to dissolve the institution of the kingship. Or rather, I should say, not necessarily dissolve the monarchy or the kingship, but rather dissolve the unwarranted, undeserved responsibility in which we were just talking about by whose not alone they were permitted to do anything, this sort of thing. Has forfeited his claim to rationality. As an apostate from the order of manhood, this unbelieving figure, and ought to be considered as one who has not only given up the proper dignity of man, but sunk himself beneath the rank of animals and contemptibly crawls through the world like a worm. He continues, however, it matters very little now what the King of England either says or does. He has wickedly broken through every moral and human obligation, trampled nature and conscience beneath his feet, and by a steady and constitutional spirit of insolence and cruelty, procured for himself a universal hatred. It is now the interest of America to provide for herself. She has already a large and young family, whom it is more her duty to take care of than to be granting away her property to support a power which has become a reproach to the names of men and Christians. You, whose office is to watch over the morals of a nation, of whatsoever sect or denomination you are of, as well as you, who are more immediately the guardians of the public liberty. If you wish to preserve your native country, uncontaminated by European corruption, you must in secret wish separation. But leaving the moral part to private reflection, I shall chiefly confine my further remarks to the following heads. And so before we get to these following heads, as he says, I would like to continue to dissect, as we have been doing, this paragraph. So, he says, it doesn't really matter now what the king does or has said. We've committed to a certain path. He's broken the moral bonds. He has disrespected his obligation. He's trampled on the nature and conscience beneath his feet. And by a steady constitutional spirit of insolence and cruelty, he has produced for himself a universal hatred. So finally, the Israelites can see why God has said, do not erect a king before you, or above you, I should say. It is now the interest of America to prove for herself. She has already a large and young family, whom it is more her duty to take care of than to be granting away her property, to support a power which has become a reproach to the names of men and Christians. So this is down to the very core of Western culture. This is how deep the American Revolution goes. Becomes a reproach. The institution that they are trying to separate from has become a reproach to the names of men and Christians. That is, in a certain sense, to the individual identity. And I say that because he mentions the names of men. If you name something, it identifies it. And Christians, which is a group of, which is a body in and of itself, full of individuals, again, with constraints on the self and on the individual, like I've discussed already in this episode. But we can see unfolding here a very complex dynamic and how this thing is very messily being separated, and how easily confused this stuff can be. You, whose office is to watch over the morals of a nation, of whatsoever sect or denomination you are of, as well as you, who are more immediately the guardians of public liberty. If you wish to preserve your native country uncontaminated by European corruption, you must in secret wish a separation. So you, he's talking to every American citizen. And when I say you now, he is still talking to us, to me and to you. So this is the key point here. Because without this point, liberalism is no better than fascism, it is no better than communism, because it is inherently an ununified thing if it doesn't accept certain responsibilities. And this responsibility is to the office which watches over the morals of the nation. The individual does this, which means that they have to take on the responsibility of building institutions that are freely and efficiently pursuing truth, whether that is in a secular manner, or rather I should say in a material context, or in a more elevated context, in the context of the church. The individual has a responsibility to engage in these things. Whatever sect or denomination you are of, as well as you yourself. You are the immediate guardians, the more immediate guardians of the public liberty. And if you wish to preserve this nation uncontaminated by the English or the European corruption, you have to wish upon this separation. And so he says, but leaving the moral part to private reflection, I shall chiefly confine my further remarks to the following heads. So I'm interested to see what he has to say here. First, that it is in the interest of America to be separated from Britain. Okay? Fairly simple, straightforward. Secondly, which is the easiest and most practicable plan, reconciliation or independence, with some occasional remarks. And so he continues here. In support of the first, I could, if I judged it proper, produce the opinion of some of the ablest and most experienced men on this continent, and whose sentiments on that head are not yet publicly known. It is in reality a self-evident position for independence, limited in its commerce and cramped and fettered in its legislative powers, can never arrive at any material eminence. America does not yet know what opulence is, and although the progress which she has made stands unparalleled in the history of other nations, it is but a childhood compared to with what she should be capable of arriving at, had she, as she ought to have, the legislative powers in her own hands. England is at this very time proudly coveting what would do her no good were she to accomplish it, and the continent hesitating on a matter which will be her final ruin if neglected. It is the commerce and not the conquest of America by which England is to be benefited, and that would be in a great measure continue were the countries as independent of each other as France and Spain, because in many articles neither can go to a better market. But it is the independence of this country, of Britain, or any other, which is now the main and only object worthy of contention, and which, like other truths discovered by necessity, will appear clearer and stronger every day. So I hesitated a few times there because as I was reading that, I was barely paying attention to what I was reading to, but rather I was reflecting on what's happening now in Russia and their invasion of Ukraine. And I've very limited understanding of their objectives, but I do have a degree of understanding. And it seems as though Russia recognizes the mistakes made in the 20th century. They understand that they can't go back to the old Russian Empire or the Russian aristocracy. And they have legitimate complaints against the liberal order that has arisen in light of the success of the United States. And they are desirous of finding a new political system because they recognize the dangers of liberalism. And I've mentioned this before, that the dangers of liberalism lies in its very draw, that is, in liberation. Because liberation can both bring ruin and it can also bring success. It is a bit of a revelation, again, in the sense that the culture itself can lose the grip on reality that's necessary for a body to sustain a unity that is towards the sort of culturally defined optimum. And this, in our case, is the monotheistic tradition in Christianity. So allow me to back up here and to recover my steps. So Russia's complaints are that the liberal order, even the traditional liberal order, was condemned at its founding because of, at least in part, because of what we see now today. And it is difficult for those who are not completely eviscerated, demolished, robbed of their attention by the recent developments of connectability, of the internet, of social media. They who are not blinded by these things should be able to recognize the depravity and the degeneracy that our current society is undergoing, and has been undergoing for quite some time. It's not just the advent of technology that has done this. This has been happening for a long time. I think about Nietzsche, I think about Dostoevsky. They were making complaints about the societal changes well before the 60s, the 1960s. They were recognizing the loss of faith in God, which is extremely important for a free man to accept, because if he does not accept this, he cannot accept the burdens of his existence, and he will desire to be a slave of some other man if he's unable to be a man himself. And of course, Nietzsche and Dostoevsky, they wrote in the late 19th century, before the First and Second World War, after the emancipation of the Russian serfs, but before the Communist Revolution. So they saw this happening. And I can't say that I blame Russia, because they're right in their critique. But I think where they go wrong is, as traditional as they claim to be, I think where they go wrong is in their lack of faith. And it is not, I believe that it is not so that the American liberal experiment is over, as much as I believe that the American soul has suffered such a state of depravity and influence by the evil spirits of the divine nature, of the spiritual, of the supernatural, that has corrupted our minds and has moved the individual. Because certainly our culture still remains a degree united. We still have functional institutions, but our cultural story continues, although it is being slowly sucked of the meaning that is the very substrate to produce a functional liberal order. We do maintain some sort of cultural cohesion. But it's within this very through line, this new age of cultural cohesion, that is becoming degenerate. And we are beginning to suffer insult after insult after insult of the authoritarian impulse returning to us from every direction. Because we are so weak, our cultural immune system is so dysfunctional that it cannot hold up against these types of attacks. And so, to return to Mr. Paine here, and to dissect his second point, which is the easiest and most practicable plan, reconciliation. This is the question: which is the easiest and most practicable plan, reconciliation or independence? And then he remarks, in the support of the first, and the first is the American separation from Britain. If I could judge it proper, produce the opinion of some of the ablest and most experienced men of this continent, and whose sentiments on that head are not yet publicly known. It is in reality a self-evident position for independence, limited in its commerce and cramped and fettered in its legislative powers, can ever arrive at any material eminence. And so, if we are to place ourselves in Russian shoes, let's say, contemporary Russian shoes, and we were to read this sentence, I think we might be a bit disappointed. Or, if we are to have the opinion of the Russian state, we might feel vindicated by this statement. Because he says, it is in reality a self-evident position for independence, limited in its commerce and cramped and fettered in its legislative powers, can ever arrive at any material eminence. Now that statement itself is pretty damning, I think, to the liberal project, because it implies part of the reason or so far the only reason that's put forth for doing this, for the separation of America and England, is this commercial prosperity, this material eminence. And of course, any enlightened person will understand that material eminence is not sustainable. It is not the thing that can unify a body and bring down the divine nature. It'll lift us up, certainly, materially. But that's it. And that is not enough for mankind. America does not yet know what opulence is, and I mean, he's completely right here. But it's truth that has to be embedded within greater truths that we should be concerned with here, not the segmental rightness or the atomized rightness. America does not yet know what opulence is, and although the progress which she has made stands unparalleled in history of other nations, it is but a childhood compared to what she should be capable of arriving at, had she, as she ought to have, the legislative powers in her own hands. And he's true, and he was right. He is right. I mean, what happened after the American Revolution is America prospered. We became the most powerful nation on the face of the earth, the richest nation on the face of the earth. England is at this time proudly coveting what would do her no good were she to accomplish it, and the continent hesitating on the matter which will be her final ruin if neglected. Which means she is coveting what would do her no good, trying to keep the colonists, keep the Americans submitted. They would not benefit from the lack of trade and the lack of opulence that America is capable of achieving. It is the commerce and not the conquest of America by which England is to be benefited. And that would be in a great measure continue, were the countries as independent of each other as France and Spain, because in many articles neither can go to a better market. But it is the independence of this country of Britain, or any other, which is now the main and only object worthy of contention, and which, like all other truths discovered by necessity, will appear clearer and stronger every day. So again, we have to remember that in the context of the spirit of the Revolutionary Era, regardless of this section that is making the case for economic independence, which is important, material prosperity brings us many benefits. But just like a drug, let's say, it is useful as a tool. We don't use it for, let's say, leisure, I suppose. We use it to bring us closer to the divine. That is the entire human project, to bring us closer to that source of the truth. So we are going to stop here today. And we will continue on next time with his reasoning.